Just as this morning, Bloomberg released a piece of news. It was only one sentence long. The United States and Iran are considering a 2-week ceasefire extension to allow more time for a peace agreement. A single sentence, barely a dozen words. But this brief statement acted as the final piece of the puzzle, bringing the fragmented chaos of the entire week into one remarkably clear picture. Let us quickly run through the timeline of the past 120 hours using the sharpest language possible. On Monday, the Islamabad negotiations collapsed. J.D. Vance called it bad news, while Iran claimed they were only one step away. Trump then announced a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. On Tuesday, CENTCOM clarified that the blockade was strictly targeting Iranian ports, not the entire Hormuz Strait. The S&P immediately wiped out all its wartime losses. The market perfectly understood the massive gap between Trump's political rhetoric and CENTCOM's tactical reality. On Wednesday, satellite images revealed Iran was building a subterranean missile city. Trump stated he received a call from the right people, while China labeled the blockade as dangerous and irresponsible. On Thursday, the U.S Iran physically intercepted an Iranian cargo ship. The blockade was no longer just a posture. It was being actively executed. Despite this, the Nasdaq surged 16% from its lowest point. And today, Friday, Bloomberg drops the leak that a ceasefire extension is being seriously considered. If you look at these 5 days individually, every single day presents an independent, terrifying turning point. But if you elevate your perspective and look down from the altitude of today, the real narrative emerges. The true story of this week is not that negotiations failed or that a blockade began. It is that both sides found a highly calculated way to limit the cost of their breakdown to an absolutely acceptable margin. This mutual containment is the fundamental prerequisite for any negotiations to continue. We are watching a textbook execution of geopolitical brinkmanship. Think back to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis or the intense proxy wars of the 1970s. During those historical flashpoints, global market volatility indexes like the VIX routinely exploded by over 50% as superpowers stared into the abyss. Yet, the architects of those crises always engineered a hidden off-ramp right before mutually assured destruction. What we are witnessing right now is not a blind descent into chaos. It is a controlled demolition of diplomatic pleasantries. They are probing the structural integrity of their opponent's bottom line. In the grand theater of international relations, a shattered negotiation table is rarely a dead end. It is simply a heavy rust-covered door that requires a much more expensive key. The illusion of maximum chaos is often the most perfect camouflage for a deeply calculated strategy. Let us seriously evaluate what the financial markets got right and what they got wrong this week. On Monday, negotiations collapsed. The blockade was proudly announced, and global markets plunged into a predictable panic. Yet, by Thursday, the S&P 500 had erased nearly all of its wartime losses, and the tech-heavy Nasdaq had surged an astonishing 16% from its lowest point. What exactly did the market get right? First, it correctly decoded the massive, critical chasm between CENTCOM and Donald Trump. Trump shouted to the world about blocking the entire Strait of Hormuz, which initially triggered a sell-off. But shortly after, CENTCOM meticulously clarified that the operation solely targeted Iranian ports, leaving the broader strait functional. The market instantly recalibrated. The Pentagon's actual, executed version of these sanctions is far gentler on the global oil supply chain than the aggressive rhetoric spoken on the political stage. Second, The market accurately anticipated the ceasefire extension long before the media caught on. The massive surge in equities contained a hidden, collective consensus. Neither side is truly ready or financially equipped to ignite an all-out regional war. Today's Bloomberg report merely validated what the smart money had already aggressively priced in on Tuesday and Wednesday. This is the terrifying power of the capital markets. It aggregates the insider knowledge of every connected player, every whispered conversation in Washington and Tehran, forming a predictive engine that is always infinitely closer to the truth than any single intelligence analyst. But why did the Nasdaq specifically explode by 16%? This reveals a much deeper structural economic logic. In the context of this specific geopolitical conflict, technology stocks, especially those driving the AI revolution, have the lowest direct correlation with global oil prices. Their primary operating costs are elite engineering talent and raw computing power, not physical barrels of crude oil. Think back to the historical parallel of the infamous 1973 oil shock. When the oil embargo was enforced, global crude prices quadrupled and the S&P 500 plummeted by nearly 48%. However, that exact macroeconomic nightmare forced global corporations to desperately seek new efficiencies, inadvertently accelerating the adoption of early microprocessors and automated logistics. We are witnessing a turbocharged version of that exact survival mechanism today. Under the crushing weight of high energy costs, everyday consumers will cancel their international vacations and reduce physical retail shopping, but they will drastically increase their consumption of digital entertainment and cloud-based AI tools. Simultaneously, global enterprises facing skyrocketing shipping and manufacturing costs will aggressively accelerate their digital transformation. They will deploy AI to optimize supply chains and reduce their reliance on energy-intensive physical processes. The Nasdaq's relentless strength is not the market saying the war is ending. It is the market ruthlessly declaring that even if the war continues, these specific technological sectors will cannibalize the old economy and grow regardless. However, we must address a highly dangerous latent error the market is currently making. It has overly optimistically priced this temporary 14-day ceasefire extension as the absolute end of the war. Let me be very clear. A ceasefire extension is merely a fragile window for continued dialogue, not a foundational resolution. The nuclear enrichment problem remains completely intact. The Strait of Hormuz is not fully, unconditionally open. Iran is still pouring concrete for its subterranean missile cities as we speak. If these fundamental issues are not legitimately addressed in the next 2 weeks, this euphoric tech rally will face a brutal reality check. Capital is like water flowing down a jagged mountain. It does not care about the political thunder roaring in the sky. It only cares about finding the path of least resistance to maximum profit. In a world paralyzed by the fear of conflict, the most dangerous gamble is not taking a risk. It is misinterpreting a temporary pause in the violence for a permanent peace. Now, let us examine the truly profound variable that emerged today. The online summit hosted by French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. This is not just another diplomatic photo op. It is a tectonic shift in the geopolitical landscape. Today, at the Elysee Palace, they launched what is being called the Hormuz Navigation Initiative. More than 40 nations from Asia, Europe, and the Middle East participated in this virtual war room. What exactly were they discussing? It was not about launching offensive military strikes, nor was it about piling on more economic sanctions. They were architecting a highly specific multilateral defensive shield. We are talking about deploying a unified international naval force to escort commercial vessels through the choke point of Hormuz, effectively neutralizing Iran's ability to intercept ships or extort transit fees. Why does this fundamentally alter the strategic reality? Let us look at the historical precedent. During the brutal Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the world witnessed the infamous tanker war phase. Over 400 civilian merchant ships were violently attacked in the Persian Gulf, causing global shipping insurance premiums to skyrocket by an unprecedented 400%. In response, the United States launched Operation Earnest Will in 1987, the largest naval convoy operation since World War II, to protect Kuwaiti oil tankers. That historical operation proved that when the critical arteries of global trade are threatened, the world will not hesitate to militarize the shipping lanes. But today, the United States does not have to bear this immense financial and military burden alone. 40 allied nations are stepping forward to share the weight. At the beginning of this current conflict, the Strait of Hormuz was essentially a bilateral gladiator arena. It was the United States aggressively blocking Iranian ports on one side, and Iran threatening to choke off global transit on the other. Two massive powers wrestling in a narrow, watery corridor. But this new multinational framework completely flips the political chessboard. It permanently transforms the Hormuz crisis from a localized U.S. Iran standoff into Iran versus the entire international community. Do you see the brilliant psychological trap being laid here? For decades, Tehran has masterfully utilized the narrative of resisting American imperialism and unilateral hegemony to unify its domestic populace and regional proxies. But how do you possibly maintain that righteous victim narrative when your adversary is no longer just the great Satan, but a unified coalition of 40 sovereign nations desperately trying to protect their economic lifelines? The Strait of Hormuz used to be a dark, narrow alleyway where two heavyweights circled each other with drawn blades. Today, 40 nations have suddenly turned on the stadium floodlights and locked the doors. Even if this immediate war concludes through diplomatic channels, this newly forged multinational security architecture will likely persist indefinitely. It is poised to become the most significant, enduring institutional legacy of this entire crisis. A single superpower can always be defied for political theater. But the combined economic gravity of the global supply chain will ruthlessly crush anyone who attempts to stand in its way. Let U.S. confront the most uncomfortable question raised by the Bloomberg leak. Is this proposed 14-day ceasefire extension a genuine resolution, or is it merely a calculated delay? Let me give you the most brutal and honest answer possible. It is a delay, but it is absolutely not a meaningless one. Why is it a delay? Because in the next 2 weeks, the deeply complex nuclear enrichment puzzle will not be solved. The long-term, structural security arrangements for the Strait of Hormuz will not be finalized. Iran's vast network of regional proxy militias will not magically vanish. These are foundational structural schisms that demand months, if not years, of grueling diplomacy. A 14-day extension is merely a fragile window allowing the oxygen of negotiation to keep flowing. It is not the finish line. But why is this delay incredibly meaningful? Because every single time a ceasefire is extended, invisible forces are compounding in the background. First, the diplomatic fog of war is lifting. The collapse in Islamabad may have looked like a failure, but it forced both Washington and Tehran to expose their absolute, unvarnished bottom lines. The next round of talks will operate on a much colder, clearer reality. Second, multinational mechanisms like the Macron-Starmer initiative are quietly laying the concrete for a permanent international framework. Third, and most importantly, the crushing weight of economic gravity is accelerating. This is where we must look at the raw data. Under the suffocating pressure of warfare and relentless international sanctions, the Iranian economy is hemorrhaging. We are looking at a scenario where the Iranian rial has suffered catastrophic depreciation in the unofficial markets, and domestic inflation is persistently burning through the purchasing power of the middle class at rates exceeding 40 to 50%. On the other side of the chessboard, the United States is not immune. In a highly sensitive election cycle, the specter of sustained high oil prices threatening to push the national average toward the deeply unpopular $4 a gallon mark, combined with sticky inflation, is acting as a relentless political tax on the current administration. As time drags on, these mutual financial bleeding rates rapidly increase the appetite for political compromise. Let me illustrate this compounding pressure with a profound historical parallel. Consider the monumental 1978 Camp David Accords. Before President Jimmy Carter locked Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem begin inside that retreat for 13 grueling days. Those two nations had been locked in a blood-soaked rivalry for 30 years, having fought 4 devastating conventional wars. Egypt was practically insolvent, allocating nearly 1/3 of its entire gross domestic product to defense spending, while inflation ravaged its domestic stability. Israel was equally exhausted by the permanent state of mobilization when the historic peace agreement finally emerged. It was not because a magical new geopolitical condition suddenly appeared out of thin air. It was because the accumulated, agonizing cost of 30 years of hostility, the compounding interest of every failed negotiation and every economic sacrifice finally pushed both nations to a critical threshold. It was the exact moment when the staggering price of continued warfare mathematically eclipsed the painful political cost of compromise. Is the current conflict approaching its own mathematical breaking point? I believe it is, though we have not arrived just yet. Every 14-day extension is a heavy, deliberate step toward that inevitable cliff edge. Think of this strategic delay not as a bridge being slowly built over a river, but as a giant, grinding industrial vice. Every 2-week extension is another turn of the screw, mercilessly squeezing out the political fantasies until nothing remains but the harsh, inescapable economic truth. When the daily cost of your political pride finally exceeds the remaining depth of your national treasury. Peace is no longer a strategic choice. It becomes a mathematical inevitability for investors operating in the highly sensitive markets of Taiwan and Hong Kong. This potential 14-day extension requires a ruthlessly objective analysis. Taiwan is almost 100% dependent on imported energy. In reality, it imports nearly 98% of its total energy requirements, primarily liquefied natural gas and coal. Hong Kong stands as one of the city economies with the absolute highest energy dependence in the entire world, possessing 0 domestic hydrocarbon resources. Throughout this war, both of these critical Asian markets have endured the crushing double pressure of inflated energy import costs and drastically reduced corporate profitability. The domino effect is unavoidable. Inflation rises and everyday consumer purchasing power collapses. If a ceasefire is formalized and oil prices begin to incrementally recede, these markets will undoubtedly experience a lightening of that immense pressure. But do not fall into the trap of expecting a V-shaped recovery. Even if the ceasefire holds, the new equilibrium price for global crude is likely to anchor between $85 and $95 a barrel, significantly higher than the pre-war baseline of $70. Why? Because the Strait of Hormuz is still not fully operational, and the disrupted supply chains will take agonizing months. From a macroeconomic perspective, every sustained $10 increase in crude oil prices historically shaves off approximately 0.2 to 0.3% from the GDP growth of these highly vulnerable, export-driven economies. So, what is the ultimate signal that the nightmare is actually over? How do we know when the market rally is fundamentally justified? You must ignore the political press conferences and focus entirely on one cold, irrefutable metric: the daily tanker count navigating through the Strait of Hormuz. Before the war commenced, roughly 130 to 160 oil tankers safely passed through that maritime chokepoint every single day. Currently, that volume remains at an incredibly low, near-paralyzed level. The true definitive signal that oil prices will sustainably drop is not a diplomatic handshake. It is watching that daily tanker count steadily climb back to 50, then 80, and finally 100 vessels until that physical movement of global cargo resumes. Any massive market rally is simply a speculative bet on an unwritten future. Investing your capital based solely on a political ceasefire without seeing the physical ships move is like betting your entire life savings on a monsoon, just because you spotted a single dark cloud on the horizon. As Charlie Munger famously practiced in times of profound chaos, you must have the discipline to hold your capital, maintain your patience, and wait until the board becomes clearly visible before you make your move. The market does not reward those who try to predict the political theater. It ruthlessly rewards those who wait in the dark, accurately counting the physical ships. We have just deconstructed 120 hours of global panic. But what does this really tell us about the nature of our world? This 14-day extension is not just a temporary ceasefire. It is a profound mirror reflecting the cold, unforgiving reality of human nature and the ultimate destiny of nations. We love to build grand narratives of absolute ideology and righteous conflict. But in the end, it is the quiet, invisible ledger of economic survival that truly dictates the fate of empires. As we observe this conflict without blinking, maintaining a serious and unyielding focus on the cold facts, the high contrast reality of this 14-day window leaves absolutely no room for illusions. The geopolitical chessboard has been completely reset, and the players are rapidly running out of time. If this analytical framework has helped you see through the blinding fog of war this week, I ask you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave your perspective in the comments below. What do you believe will actually happen on day 15? Do not just watch the news, understand the game.